they have social needs. How do we meet them? But what I knew would not work, and I knew it 10 years ago, is that you can't kind of buy a compromise, right? We're actually in, and one of the reasons this debate is difficult is it is about a fundamental moral principle. One is that our marriage tradition is bigoted because it expresses that gay unions are not as sacred or as significant to society as opposite-sex unions. And that can be expressed sometimes homophobically, but the weaker form is that marriage is heteronormative, right? It says there's something distinctive, important, special, and necessary about this kind of union, and gay people are outside it. Doesn't necessarily, lots of people are outside it. Lots of people are not married. They're not, therefore, necessarily looked down upon. But they're not doing this thing, and this thing is really important. So and I have to say I've been proved right in this rather rapidly. The position that David Blankenhorn took, which is that gay unions, the equal dignity of homosexual love and full federal civil unions, did not protect him from one iota of opprobrium when he acted on the idea that marriage is the union of husband and wife by testifying in Prop 8 in a state that had full civil unions, and it was only about the definition of marriage. So I just feel like I recognize the struggle that we are in, and it is a struggle over fundamentally whether we can retain any heteronormative understandings which are embodied in this sacred, quasi-sacred public institution called marriage.
Let's talk about the quasi-sacred claim, because earlier you mentioned that you're a devout Roman Catholic.
Oh, I don't like to give myself that much credit.
Well,
I'm a fair
okay.
Orthodox one.
You're an Orthodox Roman Catholic, and there are a lot of people who assume that your argument against same-sex marriage is that God says no. And of course, you don't make that argument in here, that God says no, although you believe that something like that, I suppose. But can you talk about how your religious views inform what you do, in fact, in the book?
Yeah, I actually think for me it works in reverse, right? I became Catholic because I came to a certain understanding about life, sex, and marriage. And what people consider the hard teachings of the church, that, I came to believe as a result of my experience and reflection that it has to be wrong to engage in a sexual relationship if you're not in a position to give your child his mother and father raising them. That means really it's not okay to have sex if you're not married, right? About 35% of Americans hold that view, but it's not very publicly prominent. So that stemmed from my belief that life in the womb is life. I've never heard a good argument for why it's okay to kill developing human beings that we would consistently apply. And you put those things together, and you get something very close to the Roman Catholic understanding of sex and marriage, and it was a fairly small step for me, therefore, to go.
So you had an understanding of sex and relationship and marriage, and when you looked at that understanding,
right? It's not so much that God teaches me, and I actually, if you read my first book, which nobody should have to, but it's called Enemies of Eros: How the Sexual Revolution is Killing Family Life and Marriage and What We Can Do About It. I wrote that. I was an atheist when I wrote it, right? And then I went back to the church in my late 20s, partly because it was the only institution I could see standing who seemed to be capturing the. And I said, well, what other truths does it have? And my faith has progressed since then. And then the other thing is, I was raising a son, and you don't pass on moral understandings alone, right? You do it in community. So those were the two strongest motivations. But I do think one of the reasons I think it's only religious people who are publicly standing against same-sex marriage at this point is not because these ideas are so theologically rooted. I mean, the idea a child needs a mom and a dad, that marriage is rooted in sexual difference. These are not, angels dancing on a pin sort of ideas, but because you have to, an enormous amount of criticism is directed against you now if you oppose same-sex marriage. And you really need a feeling that you're standing with someone and for someone. And religious people have a stronger motivation, and they have a stronger networking community. And so I don't know if that speaks to me, but I do think it's why religious, the public opposition is shrinking, and it's being narrowed to people who often have a strong religious motivation for standing up for what Naum calls the great truths of Genesis. We're born male and female, called to come together in love to bring new life.
Right. There are, of course, married couples that cannot create new life, married heterosexual couples. Mm-hmm. We talk about this a little bit in the book. An elderly couple, both widowed, who marry in their 70s. What's the function of marriage then, or do you think it's just kind of pointless, but we allow it because it's charming, or why do we support marriage in that case?
Well, I think from a legal standpoint, every marital union of male and female serves the public purpose of marriage. And you actually
How so?
see...
Because this is something I think that we try to push each other on in the book, but I'm still struggling with understanding your position.
Because every time a man and a woman commit to being in a faithful sexual union, which is not so much for gay people necessarily, but for opposite-sex couples, is part of the core understanding of marriage still. If it's not intended to be faithful, it's not marital in the public imagination. And so because, so marriage is not a factory for producing children. It's a way of regulating the sexuality of men and women so that we end up in relationships where we don't hurt each other or hurt either our actual children or our potential children. So, and if you look at the history of marriage law in this country, this is expressed over and over again. We really didn't just make this up because we don't like gay people. It's been somewhat covered up because, I think if we did not if we didn't have the contraceptive regulation, the fact that sex makes babies and we need to, they used to talk about regulating lust, right? It's sort of unattractive terms for saying you need to create a sexual order, and marriage is the pattern for creating that sexual order. And if you don't, then children get hurt, and women get hurt.
Isn't the reason that marriage is good for children largely because marriage is about committing to someone for keeps? That is, the idea that when you join together in this kind of union, you are there for each other exclusively for life, and that the reason that this protects children is because then they can count on having that.
Well, what we know from, I think this is a very rich and complicated subject that we just touch on. What we know from the social science evidence is that it's not marriage per se that protects children, because children whose mothers remarry do not do any better on average than children raised by solo mothers.
Right, because we know that divorce can be disruptive for children and their welfare.
Well, what we know is that the reason the gold standard has been the intact, married, biological family is that there's something about bringing together the child's own mother and father into one family rather than two separate families, which is protective. And I think it's a lot of things. I do think it has to do with the way... So when people aren't married, they're often looking for romantic partners, right? There's a conflict between that and being a good mother or a good father. It takes a lot of time and energy and money and resources away from the family. So simply the fact of focusing your sexual and romantic attention within the family, right? And there's a really moving to me, because of course I have a son who I raised outside of marriage. It's called This Child's View of Single Motherhood, and it's a response to Katie Roiphe's, stop criticizing single mothers, let's portray them as and it's an adult son who is a successful writer, and obviously his mother did a great job, but reflecting on what it cost her and what it cost him. And so I think the answer is really complicated. I think stability does matter. That's why stable solo mothers who don't cohabit or remarry do better than remarried than other single mothers, right? That actually looks like a fairly decent second best. So, but my question is, and we don't really know. I also do believe that children long to know what male love and what female love, and they long to know whether or not love is an exclusively female characteristic. So like when you're raised outside of marriage, one of the questions you have to deal with is, why doesn't my father seem to love me? Why does one half of the people who made me seem to not be there for me?
As I'm listening to all of this, what strikes me, two things that strike me. One is that it seems like same-sex couples and same-sex families, because one of the things, if we have time, I'd like to talk about is same-sex couples raising children. You know, I'm not, but many do. But they are sort of being made to pay the price for, you know, father abandonment by heterosexual fathers. That is, that because there is this problem where fathers don't stick around and support and love their children, that we can't support relationships of people who don't happen to fall in love heterosexually.
Well, it's only a price if you believe you have a right to have your relationship called marriage. I mean, in my view, you've decided, probably for good reason, that taking on a woman and her children is not something that's right for you, right? So it's not so much like I'm trying to make you pay a price. It's just that what you want to do is not marriage. In my view, right?
Right. No, and that I understand, but there are, of course, many people, families and so on, who want to somehow acknowledge and support that, want the law to be able to acknowledge us as the families we understand ourselves to be, want to be able to stand behind us and witness to that commitment. And it's funny because earlier you said something about passing on moral understanding in community, which struck me.
We only have about 3 minutes left, so I want to make sure you get in the heart of what you want me to answer.
All right, so because you, and I'll stick with that point then, because you recognize that we pass on moral understanding in community, marriage, and the word is important. We both agree that the word is important, but even more important is the commitment and the fact that one's family and friends and the law acknowledge the household. Marriage provides an opportunity to pass on moral understanding and community to each other and to any children who might be raised. So I guess what I'm doing is going back to my earlier concern, if not marriage, what? And I know that you feel like, well, it's not Maggie Gallagher's job to answer that question, but it's a real question.
For parents, I would say that second parent adoption is probably more significant, and in fact it's kind of dangerous to rely on marriage for your parental rights and relationships. And again, I'm focusing on the welfare of the children. I think I have concerns about deliberately creating children to be deprived of a mother and father, which would apply to opposite sex as well as same-sex couples. And, for adoption, I think that if you can replace a mother and father for a child, you should. But, babies need homes. We need to respect everyone who's trying to do it. But, so that's a very short, and we don't really have a lot of time to go into it. But if I'm right about marriage, I would say this, that it's not in gay people's interests to be messing with this core social institution, because we all need it if we believe America is a special place where an understanding that's allowed you, John, to build a life together. If we want that to project that in the future, we need to strengthen our marriage culture, because we're headed for a fairly serious problem. The best societies in the world, like America, don't seem to know how to bring men and women together to make and raise the next generation. And what I have never been able to get you to say is how we're going to strengthen this as the heteronormative ideal, while simultaneously being always pushed to say that same-sex relationships are just the same, serve the same purposes, and need to be treated just the same in the public square.
Well, so of course, I don't want to say just the same, and I realize that we have to wrap up, but I do want to say this. Like you, I want to strengthen the marriage culture. I want to strengthen commitment. I want to strengthen people's care for wrap up. But I do want to say this. Like you, I want to strengthen the marriage culture. I want to strengthen commitment. I want to strengthen people's care for their children. I want to do all that. And I hope that...
I hope I'm wrong. I hope you're right.
I hope... Well, I appreciate the opportunity to try to work it out, at least to try to work it out in the book, and hopefully an ongoing dialogue on
John,
this.
thanks so much. It's always really amazing to talk to you about these things, and I know there's a lot of people who are listening who appreciate your clarity and your commitment.